Okay, so today's video is going to be about the Women's Social and Political Union, more commonly known as the WSPU or the Suffragettes. This is to help Year 11 pupils revise for their British Depth Study exam. Now, just before I start about the Suffragettes, a little bit of information about your British Depth Study exam. So this is paper 2, the shorter of the 2 exams that you'll sit in the summer. The second paper that you sit, British Depth Study, will be on one of these 3 topics. It will either be on the liberal reforms, it will either be, or the suffragettes, or the home front, so what Britain was like during the First World War. The whole paper will be on one of those 3 topics, and so you need to make sure that you know all 3 to get the marks in the exam. So this is the first video of the 3 about the Women's Social and Political Union. This is part of your suffragettes topic. There will be more videos on this topic, so please watch out on the channel for those. So as I said, there's quite a few topics that you need to be looking at in order to understand the suffragettes topic for your exam. You need to know what life was like for women before the movement started. You need to understand the formation and the actions of the NUWSS, which stands for National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. You need to know about the WSPU, which we're looking at today, the escalation of violence in a lot of detail. You need to understand the ins and outs of the Liberal government, key political events, the suffragette campaign and the anti-suffragette campaign. Now, we're going to be focusing on the suffragette campaign and the WSPU today with a little bit of the escalation of violence. So this is the famous quote from Emmeline Pankhurst, who was the leader of the suffragettes, the WSPU, and she said deeds, not words. Now, what that means is before the suffragettes came along, all women's suffrage societies were making their points through the words that they were saying. They would make speeches, they would give out leaflets, they would write letters. But Emmeline Pankhurst said, this isn't working and we need to do something else. We need to do things. Deeds means doing things, not just talk about it. And so she founded the WSPU, and that's the centre for their beliefs and why they do the things that they did. And being able to quote this in your exam might make you look like you understand the political ideologies of the suffragettes, so that's really important. So here we have the founding members of the WSPU. Over here in the larger picture, this is Emmeline Pankhurst. She's the mother of the other 2 members that we'll talk about in a moment. Her and her husband were both Labour Party, what became the Labour Party is actually the Independent Labour Party members, and they were politically active for a really long time before the WSPU came into place. Emmeline Pankhurst was a crucial person for the WSPU. She ran a huge number of their activities. She went to America and campaigned to gain more money, and she is really famously known for her motivational and inspirational speeches. On the top over here we have Sylvia Pankhurst. Now she's a socialist politically, and she's also she was an artist, and so she was responsible for a lot of the artwork that you see, especially in the early WSPU posters and things like that, and she was really active in campaigns. And then at the bottom here we have Christabel Pankhurst, who was present or acted out the first militant act in 1905, and at one point had to flee to Paris because she was wanted by the police. Okay, so I know it's really annoying when your teacher just goes through a slideshow and reads off the slide, but you'll have to forgive me this once because I want you to remember all of these important pieces of information. If you've got a pen and paper handy, I suggest that you write things down as we go along and take notes and do whatever it is that you need to do to help you revise. And so the women who formed the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, were originally part of a political party called the Independent Labour Party. Emmeline Pankhurst's husband was part of the Independent Labour Party, so were her and her 2 daughters. And so they were really politically active before the WSPU was formed. They formed the WSPU in 1913 because they didn't feel that the major political parties or the the suffrage campaign that already existed was really doing anything to further the cause or doing enough. And so they set up the WSPU to fill that void. The first militant act, if you're not sure what militant means an act of violence to put across a political point, or an aggressive action, I suppose. The first militant act was when Christabel Pankhurst and Annie Kenney started shouting during a political meeting. I think it was a Liberal meeting. And I think I read somewhere that Winston Churchill was actually there. I'm not sure. But anyway, they were at a political meeting and they started shouting and shouting and shouting. And when are you going to give women the vote? They were kicked out. And as they were kicked out, it is reported that Christabel spat at a police officer, which became known as the first militant act in 1905. Although there were some working class members of the WSPU, so Annie Kenney is an example of this because she was a working class girl. The majority of WSPU members were middle class and some were even upper class women. So these are the very rich people in society. Initially, the WSPU started at by-elections. A by-election is where you have an election in between general elections. So a general election, the whole country goes out and votes and picks their MP in their local area. But a by-election is in between those major elections where an MP either dies or quits or is forced to leave their job. And so a new MP needs to be elected just for that small area. And that's where the WSPU started off their campaigning. With the political parties, alongside them having stalls, handing out leaflets and doing that kind of thing. But because they were still being ignored and things weren't quite moving as fast as the Pankhursts wanted, they started demonstrating and protesting. They started off with the Independent Labour Party because that's where their origins were, but they decided to be independent and started protesting on a much larger scale. Towards the end of the period, so towards the end of 1912, 1913, you see a huge amount of violence. Some examples of this I've put are setting post boxes on fire, smashing shop windows, and there was even a bomb set off in Lloyd George's summer home when it was empty. Now, one thing that's really important for you to know for your exam is that the suffragettes knew how to play the media. Their main focus was getting attention from newspapers, getting their name in the newspapers, and getting people hearing about what they were about. And so they were all about image, and the image that they put across usually appears in these three colours, green, white and purple, which represent hope, purity and dignity. So again, they were really, really good at putting across an image and controlling the kind of image that they give. So if we have a look at a few of the examples that we can see on the page over here. So if we start with the logo, so we can see the three colours for hope, purity and dignity. Oh, sorry, yeah, that's right. And what we've got here is a woman dressed up as an angel, as we can see from her wings. So that's the kind of the purity element. That's why she's white as well. We've got the colours. You can see the word freedom displayed really clearly. And because this is quite a simple design, you could have this appear on badges, which it did. You could have it pinned to dresses, sewed onto sashes. And so this was something that you would see everywhere and everyone would know what it meant. You've also got, for the protests, women would make these huge banners. And so this is from, obviously, the area of London, Hammersmith. And it's got, the same suffragette colours, purple, white and green. And it has their motto, deeds, not words. And so if you got this as a source in your exam, then you would be able to talk about that being their motto and why it links to their ideology, etc., etc. But women would carry these with them on their protest marches. This is my favourite one of the ones that we'll be looking at. So this is a suffragette teacup and saucer, which would be part of a WSPU suffragette set. The suffragettes had shops that they would sell their merchandise in to help them raise money, and this is one example of the things that you could buy with the suffragette logo and colours on it, which I just think that's quite funny. If you're familiar with Leicester at all, then in Bowling Green Street there was a suffragette shop set up. And then this is the last one that we'll be having a look at. Now, this is a copy of The Suffragette, which is the WSPU's magazine. So what we can see here are a few quite interesting things. Let's have a look at them in a little bit more detail. So the first thing that I want us to talk about here is this woman. She's dressed as a knight. I think she even looks a little bit like Joan of Arc, which is something you need to go and read up about if you're not sure who Joan of Arc is. But the suffragettes would dress up, and there actually was one example of a suffragette who would go dressed up as a knight and as Joan of Arc on their demonstrations. But they're showing themselves as soldiers. They're not trying to look necessarily feminine all the time, but they make themselves look like soldiers, and they link themselves to fighting and chivalry and all those things quite a lot. We've also got in this source, we've got the forces of evil denouncing the bearers of light. And so the forces of evil are the government, the bearers of light are the suffragettes. And then we can see here we have the press, and we have the I think that says government on it, or liberals, the dragon and the man leading the dragon. So it's showing how, through symbolism, how the suffragettes felt about the press and about the government, which would be a source that I wouldn't be surprised if you get. So get used to these kind of things. If you go onto Google, you can have a look at all these pictures, all of these items that they sold, or their banners. Loads of front covers of the suffragette are available online. So go and have a look and have a practice analysing them like you would like in a lesson. One of the key topics that you need to be aware of for the coming exams is the Cat and Mouse Act. I don't have time to go into it in this video too much, unfortunately, but if you go onto BBC Bitesize, there's a really, really good section about the Cat and Mouse Act on there. You need to understand this. It is one of the most important topics. And I've also put on here for you what I think is one of the most important sources as well. This is a suffragette poster that says, keep the Liberal cat, electors vote against him, keep the Liberal out. And this is all about all the horrible things that the Liberal government did to the suffragettes while they're in prison, which I'll talk about in a minute. Okay, one of the things that I really recommend that you get your head around when it comes to your British Depth Study exam is understanding what year each of the events that you need to know happened. Because if you get a source that's published in 1910, then you need to know the political context that's going on around the source. So if you see a poster from 1910, you would need to be able to talk about how the Liberals had been re-elected, for example, or that there was a truce between the suffragettes and the government. And those are the kind of things you need to be able to talk about in your answer. And so take some time. I always revise by writing my own timelines. And so pause this video, take some time and write your own, and get somebody to test you on it. So get them to ask you an event, and then you can say what year it happened in, and keep testing yourself over and over and over again, so that when you see a source, you're able to put it into context. So just quickly before we move on, the WSPU, as we said, is founded in 1903. 1905, the First Militant Act, which we talked about. The Liberal Party come into power in 1906. In 1908, Herbert Asquith becomes MP. So just be aware that that's one of the key players in the timeline from there on. So make sure that you firstly know what Herbert Asquith looks like, and be aware that you might need to talk about him in your exam. Then in 1909, this is an important one, hunger strikes start happening in prison. So suffragettes were taken to prison for the crimes they committed, smashing windows, setting fire to post boxes, whatever it was. And they would be put into normal prison cells. Now, if you're a political prisoner at this time, then you're allowed to wear your own clothes. You're allowed to have certain rights while you're in prison. But the suffragettes didn't get that. They were kept in the prison with the rest of the people who were there for committing crimes that weren't political, and they were really angry by this, because they didn't see themselves as being taken seriously as political activists. And so what they did is they went on hunger strike, and so they refused to eat until they were seen as political prisoners. Now, this was clever for two reasons. Firstly, it drew a lot of media attention to the suffragettes, and secondly, if women were getting mistreated in prison, it made the government look really, really bad. And from 1919, something called force feeding is introduced. Now, that is where suffragettes would have pipes shoved down their throats or down their noses, and they would have things like milk or raw eggs poured into their stomachs forcibly to make them eat, so that they wouldn't starve or get really ill in prison. And so you can imagine how painful and horrible that would be. It was actually defined by the suffragettes as institutionalised rape. It had such a catastrophic effect on the women who had to endure it, both physically and psychologically. And so that happens. Also in 1909, you might well get a source about from a campaign that's against women's suffrage. So the National League for Opposing Women's Suffrage is set up in 1909. In 1910, the Liberals are re-elected, and there is a small truth while there's a second reading of the suffrage bill, which goes wrong, unfortunately. And then in my favourite campaign, actually, in 1919, the suffragettes and other groups, I think, started a no vote, no census campaign. Now, the census is where once every 10 years, the government keeps a record of where everybody is, how old everybody is, what jobs they're doing, and just basic information about them to keep tabs on everybody, basically. And the suffragettes said, well, if I'm not getting a vote, then I'm not seen as a citizen of this country, and so I'm not going to be involved in the census. And so rather than being home on the night of the census to get themselves recorded, they would go into really strange and wonderful places. And so there were 2 women who managed to sneak into the Houses of Parliament on census night, and so they could put as their current address the Houses of Parliament instead of where they actually lived. And so it's just a well, I suppose it's almost a media stunt, but it's a really clever way of drawing attention to their cause. There is an escalation in the kinds of violence and the actions that we see after 1912. And so in 1912 was the first major window smashing campaign. What the suffragettes would do is they would have a small hammer that would fit in the sleeve of their dresses, and they would walk past windows and smash them and hide the hammer away very, very quickly so they wouldn't get caught. But this was a huge planned, orchestrated campaign in 1912. And also, it's a little bit too detailed for you, so don't worry, but Emmeline Pankhurst is expelled from the WSPU at this point. Now, for me, the most important thing is that the suffragette newspaper, the one I showed you a picture of earlier, was set up in 1912. In 1913, the Speaker's ruling means that the Reform Bill is not going to involve women, and so there was no chance of women getting the vote in 1913, like a lot of the suffragettes hoped. And so the Reform Bill failed, and as a result, militant action escalated. This is when the bombing of Lloyd George's house takes place. Arson, which is setting fire to things, starts to happen quite regularly. This is also the year of the Cat and Mouse Act, which, as I said earlier, you need to go and research if you're not sure what that is. The WSPU offices were raided by the police this year. And that famous example that I'm hoping that you know, Emily Wilding Davison dies by being trampled by the King's horse at the Royal Derby. If you're not sure about that event, then I suggest that you go and find out, because it is probably one of the most important events that you need to revise for your topic. And then, as we know, in 1914, World War I breaks out, suffragette prisoners are released, and the WSPU stop campaigning and ask their members to support the war effort. So the campaign is over for the WSPU. Now, we spend so much time talking about how women campaign for the vote. I think it's important that we know when they actually got it. So in 1918, women over the age of 30 who were property owners were given the right to vote. In 1925, women's rights over their children were recognised. So until 1925, the decisions about child welfare was made by their father, and women didn't have much of a say in it. And then in 1928, women were allowed votes on the same grounds as men, although I've put groups because I think I was a bit tired when I made this video, but it's the same grounds as men. Okay, so it's over to you. One of the questions that you might get for an 8 marker in this exam is, why was this source published in whatever year? Use the source and your own knowledge in your answer. And so, seeing as we've spent a lot of time on the suffragette, I've given you the copy of the suffragette. Seeing as we talked about force feeding, I've given you a picture of force feeding. And then, because I want you to go and revise the Cat and Mouse Act, I've given you the poster I showed you earlier on in the video. Your challenge is to pause the video and go and answer an 8-mark question based on these sources. So why was this source published in 1913? Good luck.